Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being with us this morning. My name is Sam Shinbaga, and I oversee the community development group here at the ARC. Apologies for the delay, and I think maybe many of us might have had this experience, but at 8:59, I ended up losing internet. So I am dialing in from my phone now. So apologies for the delay. Thank you for being here. I will say this, though, that no matter how much you like or do not like the virtual meetings, today is definitely the kind of day that you're glad to be joining this meeting virtually and not be driving in the rain and making it to downtown. So again, thank you for being here. Just to emphasize, the purpose of today's meeting is for us to begin the process of understanding how ARC can create a resource that would be helpful for all of y'all's local governments as you're making development decisions that balance the need for growth, the potential for growth, and tax revenue with minimizing displacement that could also fundamentally change the community character that you have. Now, we have seen this as ARC staff and heard this from all our communities across Metro Atlanta. This is not just confined to a handful of communities. We hear this concern in many places, and that's why we thought creating such a resource that could help all the communities that are trying to deal with this will be helpful. But that's why we're here today, is to learn what could be helpful and if it could be helpful. But before we begin the session, I did want to take a moment to mention what happened in our very own Atlanta last week. The senseless killing of 8 people, including 6 Asian women. And I wanted to mention that because it is very relevant, I think, to our discussion today. We, as ARC community development staff, sat down early in the week at our staff meeting, and just like we did after the killing of George Floyd, we asked ourselves, what can we do as planners, as community development staff, and what can we learn, and what can we do better moving forward to address some of these things that we're learning. And that's where I think I really do think the topic of discussion today is a very important area. Displacement, gentrification, where the recent event has really taught us why we need to approach these topics differently. And I know it may not be making a lot of sense, but I'm hoping I can make a bit more sense in the next in a little bit. But in the aftermath of the shooting, the entire immigrant community has been living in fear. Not just because it was Asian people that were attacked or minorities that were attacked, but also I do think because of where this happened. You see these strip shopping centers that we see across Metro Atlanta that in many cases are minority owned and have often been seen in planning circles as eyesores or poor planning practice, also need to be seen as places of refuge and of safety for our region's growing minority populations. And even more so because as we continue to grow as a region, mostly due to in-migration as opposed to just natural increase, and as a result, we're going to continue to diversify as a region. These places are the welcoming gateways where our new residents who are arriving into our region get a feeling of comfort, a sense of belonging, and feel at home. So it becomes even more vital, in my opinion, that we retain the essence of these places. And so while we may drive down Beaufort Highway as an example and talk about the poor state of parking and the signage and the condition of building facades, I do think there's a lot more about the value and purpose of these places that we as planning professionals will continue to learn about before we start drawing up these concepts for redevelopment based on sort of the economic value of land. So we really do need to recognize that, I think, and incorporate those lessons into our planning process. Because what we're trying to avoid, or at least in our attempt with this work, what we're trying to avoid is just like some in the planning community, we're shocked or continue to being shocked by, as we learn about how we as planners have helped create or support the systemic racism through our zoning ordinances and land use practices. I am hoping that as we learn more, we don't continue to be unaware of our ability to contribute to this loss of these unique places as we pursue our redevelopment projects. I really don't think any of us want to do that, but I did feel like that is something we need to be very conscious of. And that's frankly why I think this topic today is very opportune. I do look forward to working with all of you in crafting this in the next few months. And I'm really hoping you will help us by participating in the conversation today. So that I just wanted to sort of mention that as it was top of mind for me these last few days, but we will kick things off today. We have an exciting agenda, and we'll kick things off with a presentation from Lynn Patterson, who's principal with 3 Points Planning. Lynn is part of a team led by Sizemore that is helping ARC's community development staff on a number of community planning assignments. And Lynn will talk about the purpose of the work that we're trying to do here, and based on her extensive experience working with local governments, provide an overview of some of the issues that she's seen and helped address as it relates to small business displacement. And before we get into that exciting stuff, though, we do need to make sure we get some of the general housekeeping taken care of. So for that, I am going to turn it over to our very own Jared Lombard for just a minute. And again, thanks for being here today.
Yeah. And thank you, Sam, for those thoughts. So some general housekeeping. It's been a year of using Zoom in meetings, so hopefully everyone knows how to participate. We are using this as more of a workshop style, so we'll have some breakout rooms later today that we would want you to actually use the annotate feature to annotate the whiteboard. We really encourage you to leave your comments and information in the chat, or later today, also raise your hand to speak. The facilitator at that time will call on you as well. But before we also get started with Lynn, we do have a couple questions that we do want to ask you just generally about who's here in the audience, but also how your is working right now. So, but that is not working right now, which I'm not sure why. Because someone is, yeah. Anyway, so we're going to skip those polls and just go straight to Lynn. So today's first speaker is Lynn Patterson. And I'm going to turn over screen sharing to Lynn. So take it away, Lynn.
Thank you. Let's see. Good morning, everybody. Jared, thank you, and Sam, thank you for that great introduction. I think it gives us a lot of things to be thinking about as we are, thinking about our communities and our small businesses and the economic value of land in our different parts of, so I'm trying to get my screen share going. I'm not sure if it's up yet. Is it up yet?
Yes, it is.
Up. Okay, all right. Thinking about economic value and generating revenue and investing in places, and I don't want to say pitting that against, but also incorporating cultural value and cultural identity in these places that make them unique, and we'll talk about that. I am, as Sam mentioned, working with an incredible team led by Sizemore. They're phenomenal, and I encourage them as I go through this. This is not a lecture by me, but it's rather a talk and giving us a place to start as we have this workshop talking about preventing commercial displacement. So if they so feel inclined, I encourage them to pop in. I know we have a lot of questions that we want to get answered, and I want to make sure that we address those. So I'm going to start. The title or the topic is Preventing Commercial Displacement and Preserving Cultural and Legacy Businesses. And let me just first kind of talk about what our purpose and our goals are. We have, there's sort of two purposes and two goals, and one is our general scope, which I want to share with you about why we're here, and then today's specific. So as Sam mentioned, we're working actually on a toolkit to provide to our communities across the region that hopefully will have value for all communities to be able to find elements in there that work for your specific cases. And that toolkit is really looking at commercial displacement, how to measure it, how to track it, how to keep your finger on the pulse. You may already be doing that, and that'll be great. We're going to talk through that, but also some strategies and thoughts about how to continue to do that or to implement that in your own communities. And then second, some strategies. How can we tailor some both proactive and of course reactive? Sometimes these things have already happened. How do you get businesses back in your community, but how do you be proactive about addressing displacement? The second part of the scope, this is the first in a series of conversations that we're going to have today, where we'll be reaching out into the communities, and we're going to ask you for some ideas of other folks that we can be talking to, because again, this toolkit, I do teach at Georgia Tech. I teach planning there as well, and this is not about sitting in an ivory tower, but it's actually being out into the community and understanding what it is that we're trying to accomplish with the toolkit that's very, very useful for all of you. The second, today's, the scope and the goals really is, I want to start my part of this. I say that I got selected as tribute because of that great team that we've got. But as I'm going to provide us with a common knowledge base so that we can have a really good discourse about what it is that we're trying to do. What is commercial displacement? Why is it important? Why is it important to each of your communities? And what are the ways in which we can start to approach it? And what are the things that you're looking for? So again, getting everybody on the same page. And then probably the most beneficial part of all of this is this feedback that we're going to be getting from you. We've devoted a ton of time, the majority of time in this, this meeting today, getting feedback through breakout sessions, Q&A, and the large group discussion, because we really want to gather and understand what are the specific issues in each of your communities that we should be thinking about as we're putting together strategies. I've been working in economic development for over 25 years in small communities, rural communities, urban communities, really working with small businesses as well as large companies. And I think that this is a key component. We've been talking about this issue about commercial displacement forever. When we saw Walmart's coming in and we've got to save mom and pop businesses all the way up to current day, and we're seeing the stressors that are happening in the community. So I want to talk about those stressors for a second. Obviously, the CDAP program, which is where this is coming out of, is addressing local business displacement. As Sam mentioned, it's something that has been discussed across communities. It's not unique to one or two communities. It can be from areas that are experiencing economic downturns to areas that are experiencing economic booms. And how do we really support that, and why is it important to support these local businesses? So I start from a place of community resiliency, which is also part of the CDAP program. And when we're looking at resiliency, we're really thinking about how to people, communities, businesses, how do you continue to survive and hopefully even thrive in a place where you've got disruptors, right? Whether those disruptors are chronic or acute, whether they are a natural disaster, which we have seen happen with tornadoes. I mean, obviously in our part, we don't have maybe the same disasters as other parts of the country, but we definitely have flooding, we have other issues that come up. The pandemic, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the pandemic. I don't think anybody cannot talk about the pandemic. What is that doing to our communities? How is that reshaping and negatively impacting our communities, particularly small businesses? And you all know this, I don't have to beat that horse, but I think it's important to mention. A large employer closure. If we think pre-pandemic, current economic conditions, if you have a large employer that closes in your community, it has ripple effects all the way down to local businesses, whether those are local restaurants that are supplying, that provide lunch for the lunch crowd, or whether it's, part of the supply chain. It does not matter. Any large employer can certainly be a shock to the system. Overall economic downturn, of course, that's always something to be concerned about. Big box and online retailers, we have seen a shift for sure in the way that retail is carried out. As I mentioned before, that Walmarts and Targets start to push out the small shops. So do they, obviously, online retailers without needing that brick and mortar have had an impact. I know we all have had a lot of Amazon boxes appear on our doorstep lately, and certainly in the last year. But how is that affecting our local businesses? And where's the place for those? I think that's something that we're going to ask to think about. It's not one or the other, right? How is there a place for big box and online retailers and still supporting those local businesses, those cultural businesses, those legacy businesses that we're going to talk about? Gentrification, the G word, the dirty word. Anytime you have gentrification, you're going to start to see a shift in the kinds of inhabitants, whether they're business or residential inhabitants in a community. And that can be, again, sort of a shock to the system. Rising land costs, and I'll go into this in a moment, certainly, as well as neighborhood change. When we're talking about local businesses, I'll probably beat this horse to death, that it really has a lot to do with the clientele, that local businesses support the local community. And when you start to see neighborhoods change for a bevy of reasons, what does that do to the local businesses, and how can we support that? So I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to ask you all to get your chat, your keyboards going. And throw up a couple of words. What's your vision of a healthy, resilient commercial neighborhood? You notice I'm not saying, I don't want to talk about what malls look like. What does a healthy, resilient commercial area look like in the neighborhood? And I don't know if I can see the chat, but I'm going to try. Somebody help me. Are we throwing up words?
No one's else.
Nobody's typing. You're making me sound.
Diverse was the first.
Diverse? Okay. Oh, yeah. Here we go. Now I can see it. I've got 3 screens. Mixture businesses, fresh foods, lots of small businesses, green space, active, walkers. Yeah, a lot of pedestrians. Integrated into the community, public art, smart urban design, small business, accessible. Yeah, right? These are things that a healthy, vibrant community looks like. Walkable space that has diversity of customers, businesses and restaurants. So you've got you're capturing some outside money into your community, as well as minimizing leakage, right? Programming in public spaces, pedestrian scale. These are awesome. Okay. So, what does that look like? See if it comes up over here on my screen. Give me a second. Does it look like this? Right, this one could be. Does it look like this? And I'm going to apologize if I don't have a picture of your community. Cultural businesses, right? Art, talked about art already. again, sort of cultural, thank you to ARC for providing me these photos, but to show that there's sort of this diversity of uses that somebody just said, mix of uses. Marissa, thank you. You know, everything from realtors to taxes to banks, obviously grocery stores. Here's another one, local, very, very local business. There's a local, but also there's a chain in there, right? There's a Ross, a Planet Fitness, Venture PCS. Where does it look like this? Or all of those, right? So this is a redevelopment. These pictures look very different than this picture. And this is, I think this last picture is exciting. It's a redevelopment opportunity. It allows for that pedestrian scale, the restaurants, the uses, but what happens to some of those other businesses that may have been on or near these sites, not this particular site, but on or near the site happens to be, doesn't have that same negative impact maybe, but we'd still have, when you have a piece of property, rising land values, and you go back, and Sam mentioned, you know, we've got strip shopping centers that aren't always the most attractive, and they want to go in, this is a great piece of land, it's already got the infrastructure, it's already got a lot of the components, but we're going to redevelop it. What happens to those existing businesses that create that identity, that mix of uses that you know, we've been talking about, that may serve the local community? Or more importantly, you know, we talk a lot about, as planners, creating a sense of place, creating unique identities. Why do we want to go there? We don't want to go to Panera in every neighborhood. It doesn't, no offense to Panera, please. But what is it that makes that place unique, that makes you want to go and step out of your own community into another? So before I start, so thinking about what those look like, thinking about what that healthy, vibrant community looks like in your own mind, let's just get some common concepts out of the way. Gentrification, I mentioned, we'll just get on the same page. I'm happy to have a conversation about it. My worry with gentrification, and I'm just being super honest about it, is that we all get, it's a very loaded term. And I think we're not trying to solve the problem of gentrification in its entirety. What we're trying to say is, when you have this shifting, right? This changing, this shift from a lower income investment target to a higher income, how do you preserve some of those businesses that are there? We all want higher revenues. We all want, you know, to maximize and highest and best use, but what is that trade-off that I mentioned at the beginning, the economic value versus that sort of local cultural value that you have? Local business, which one of the issues, the outcomes of gentrification, typically we talk about it in residential gentrification, moving inhabitants out, but you can also see that businesses get moved out. And so local business displacement is when we start to see businesses forced out of their current locations due to some of those disruptors that I mentioned when I was talking about community resiliency. You know, those could be direct or indirect disruptors. It could be, we are tearing down the building that you're in because you don't own it. I'll come back to that again. And you've lost your lease, or we're renovating and your lease rates, your rents are too high and you can't stay here. Or it could be indirect displacement because of the changing neighborhood clientele that you normally would serve, especially with retail and services. You're no longer, that group is no longer there. And so you need to relocate. So there's a lot of reasons why you might see some displacement. And that's what we're trying to get to, trying to understand the reasons for displacement and then strategies that can address it. Two other terms, cultural business. One is that those are small businesses that are representative of the community's identity. You know, whether you saw on that previous slide, whether it's an ethnic restaurant or it is, you know, it doesn't have to be an ethnic restaurant. It could be the bar and grill that's been down the street for years that everybody goes to, or you know, it's a representation of that area, that community. Another one is a legacy business, which is sort of like a cultural business, except it's been there. So the place that's been there forever and ever, everybody knows about it, everybody relies upon it, and all of a sudden, you know, and it's made a contribution to that identity, and then it is displaced, it's forced out. Deanna and I have talked, Deanna Murphy from Sizemore and I have talked about Toco Hills, which I adore. It's a great little shopping center. And a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, they underwent some renovations and upgraded the entire shopping center. And there was a big to-do. That Bagel Palace that had been there for over 25 years, not quite 30, but 25 years, it was an institution, was displaced. And where are they going to go? And there was a lot of community pushback because of the cultural identity, the legacy business, and all of a sudden it was gone. And so how do you keep that from happening? If it's just a rent issue, I mean, if there's other issues, that's a different story, but, or what are some of those issues that we can address that we can be proactive about? So sorry to pick on Toco Hills and Bagel Palace, but I think it's a good example. So what causes it? Again, this is to help shape our discussion a little bit. We have rising land costs and rents. When you've got, acreage going for $1 million an acre, it's really, really hard to not have highest and best use from an just a strict economic perspective. And maybe some of those smaller businesses aren't being able to give you that rent, or they're located in a single story building, and you could have somebody come in and build, a multi-story building there, and or maybe it's townhomes, or maybe it's, apartments that go in that can generate $40 million of investment or $100 million of investment. That certainly outplays what you have going with your single story development that houses some of these long-standing businesses, legacy and cultural businesses. Another issue is lack of ownership. We see a lot of small businesses are renters, not owners. So they are very susceptible to changes in the market. So when the rents go up, they don't have a lot of, they also, to the next point, they don't have the real estate or financial or legal expertise when it comes to commercial lease negotiation. So because they don't have those resources, they're very, again, vulnerable to changes in the market and changes in leases and developments. Changing clientele, I've already mentioned. Redevelopment of properties, I've already mentioned, they get pushed out. And then, of course, the pandemic. What has happened with our communities, in our communities with regard to local and small businesses with the pandemic? How has that reshaped? How has that put small businesses out of business, or certainly impacted them so negatively that they're really struggling? Now, I bring all that up. It's great to understand why, but why should we care, right? I mean, and I say that it's not a callous way, but why? There are definite impacts in our communities when we lose our local businesses, our cultural and legacy businesses. They're incredibly important, I said it before, for sense of community, for that unique identity, for that sense of place. When you start to lose that, you lose that neighborhood identity. We can go way back to Jane Jacobs and her battle with Robert Moses, and why it was important not to have the Lomex cross, through the neighborhood, and why it was important to keep the village as it was. It also has some very real impacts on the community when small businesses close, not just identity, which is incredibly important, but it also has some sort of functional impacts, and that's loss of goods and services for local residents. In communities where transportation is difficult, in communities where there are special needs, and they have, they are reliant upon those local goods and services to provide for them, whether it's a lower income community and it's a grocer, or it's a community where there's special dietary restrictions or language issues, or just overall culture and comfort. Losing those goods and services in those local, for those local residents can be devastating. It creates neighborhood instability. There's changeover. You don't have that same sense of knowledge and security of what's in the neighborhood. Small businesses, local businesses actually hire more per square foot, have more employees per square foot than chains. And so it can lead to loss of local jobs and income. You see a lot of small businesses hiring locally. And that obviously would have a detrimental impact on the surrounding neighborhood. And then, of course, there's loss of entrepreneurship opportunities. Small businesses are, in fact, our greatest number of businesses and also create the greatest number of jobs. And so when we lose that ability for a small business to operate and to grow and to thrive, we end up potentially stymieing that business in the long run. So questions that I think we need to be asking ourselves as we go through this with the development of the toolkit. I'm trying to stay on time. I have no idea. I'll go a little bit quicker, sorry. Questions that we need to be asking as we go back and we master plan. Everybody wants to see this, right? Everybody wants to see, it's great to have a master plan to redevelop a property where you've got a hotel and you've got residential, you've got mixed use, you've got apartments, you've got retail, a food hall, all sorts of amenities. Chambly has an opportunity too for a master plan. We want revival of those neglected and disinvested areas. Absolutely, everybody wants it. We want capital investment because what does it do? It creates safer communities, right? Better services, jobs, thriving businesses, all of those things. But how do we manage? What's that inherent value of those local businesses as part of that equation? They may not, the trick with sometimes with redevelopment is we see that you have the credit tenants, which are easy to go and get financing for that developer to go to the bank and say, hey, I secured Dunkin' Donuts, or I secured, you know, I don't know, Starbucks in the development. It's a lot easier to get financing for that than it is, well, there's this local guy who wants to open a coffee shop and I want them to be tenants. So, you know, what's the inherent value versus the economic value of those local businesses, and how do we balance that? How do we balance that investment, the service, other services that folks want with our cultural legacy businesses to maintain that unique sense? So I'm just going to finish this last part, if that's okay. The couple of types of strategies that I just wanted to mention just to get the juices flowing for our conversation, our upcoming conversation, and that is, how are we tracking local business displacement and what are some sample policies and programs? So first, maybe you're already doing this, and this is again for you to be thinking about. You may be doing it, not realizing that it's helpful for business displacement, but doing local business surveys. We've seen really some very good success with local business surveys, with business retention visits and interviews. In economic development, we spend a lot of time going to meet with our big companies. How's it going? We don't want you to leave. You know, how's your workforce training? If you have any issues, are we doing that in our small communities, for our small businesses as well? Sitting down, having conversations with them. What are the issues that you're facing? So really thinking about those two hand in hand from a survey and a visitor interview perspective. That way you've got your finger on the pulse of whether they're thinking about leaving, whether they're struggling. They may not be reaching out. They may not be asking the questions, help me, I need help, because they don't realize that that's a resource that they can get. Residential displacement data, if we start to see a shift in the community and the income levels and an out-migration or an in-migration of certain groups, that can give you, again, an indication of whether or not, and you may have some displacement on the horizon. And then, of course, mapping any kind of changing business locations. Are you losing them outright, or did they just move around the corner, right? So what's happening to these businesses? Are they closing? Are they relocating to a different place? And what does that mix look like? So all of those are really important tracking techniques. The last piece that I will say is that just a couple of strategies that people have started to think about, communities have started to think about and have incorporated that have been successful. Inclusionary zoning, we know already from a affordable housing perspective, but imagine that shifted to commercial, right? Imagine that we're requiring either small business spaces, so retail, you put in your zoning code in your zoning district that you cannot have retail over 2,000 square feet in a certain area. That keeps the spaces small. It keeps them hopefully affordable and accessible to a lot of those small businesses. I'm not saying 2,000 is the right number. I'm just giving you an example. Mixed use zoning, including if you're worried about residential townhomes and apartments coming in and taking over and rezoning, the protective zoning, trying to make sure that we have that balance of uses and we're not rezoning just to get that economic value from a housing project, but allowing for that mixed use to incorporate some retail spaces, some small commercial spaces, live work spaces where you can have some of those local services still be present in the community. Local hiring and job training and procurement opportunities, I mentioned that before. There's an opportunity to create that stability by doing some of those things. Community benefits agreements where you have developer come in and they may want to, it could even be with density bonuses. It could be that they do set-asides for small businesses. They have a couple of units in a new development that they have reserved and done some rent control for, et cetera. So there's some good opportunity there. Local professional resources, I mentioned earlier that we end up seeing a lot of businesses that don't have the technical, the legal, the financial or real estate expertise, but being able to create opportunities for that so that they do have a leg up when they're negotiating with big companies on lease rates, et cetera, and what their rights are. And then of course, there's an opportunity at the local government or private or public-private partnerships as well for incubators and micro-entrepreneur spaces. And so we're gonna start exploring some of those, but what we'd like to really hear are your ideas about what's important to you. That's sort of the spaghetti on the wall kind of, here are some things that are out there that we think might make sense in a toolkit to be looking at, but we want to hear from you. And so we've got a whole list of questions for you in our breakout sessions. And this is really, we want to hear, what are your experiences in terms of, have you experienced gentrification or displacement, whatever you want to call it? How do you define it? Have you been measuring it? You know, have the businesses been asking for help, not just in the pandemic, but even before that? You know, what is the relationship with the local businesses and your offices and your community about trying to address this proactively as well as reactively? What are your challenges with retention? And then how can our toolkit help? Then we're going to come back. We're going to do a little bit of, we're going to ask for a scribe. So we're going to ask some folks to come back and share what your group had to say, because I think there's so much benefit in hearing what the different groups are saying, and then coming back, and then we'll move into a full group discussion about the strategies, some strategies that you've used, pros and cons, resources that you'd like to see, again, in the toolkit that would help your community as well as the larger group. And then last but not least, who else should we be talking to? It is really important that we capture what's really important by talking to a number of stakeholders. So with that, I hope I didn't go too far over. Hope I'm okay. And I'll shift back to moving in. Carrie, do you want to take us into the, let me see we're going to move into the breakout sessions, or Jared?
Yep.
Okay.
We're going to move into the breakout session. And if you have any questions, just feel free to send me a chat message as well. So I'll see you in a few minutes.
Well, we're repopulating. Everybody's coming out of their breakout sessions. I think, Jared, I think we're all back. So welcome back, and great, everyone. I was going to invite everyone to put their cameras on, but we seem to all have our cameras on. So I'll be calling on each one of the groups, and your scribe or representative will outline the discussion that you had at the meetings. So I will start with my group, which was group number 1.
Okay, so I unmute myself. That was my question. Okay, so our group, we had Allison, Albert, Stephen, and Carrie, and myself on here, and we got through some of the discussions. When we talked about gentrification and what it meant to the community, we sort of talked a little bit about redevelopment in the area and how there are some codes or resistance by existing neighbors and whatnot to do some more unique type redevelopment that may actually help with the consistency of locating those new businesses within the existing sort of community to be more compatible with that. And then we got into talking about form-based code and how that works with being able to sort of help allow some of these existing businesses remain because as you know, form-based code is based more on the form and not the use. And in some cases, well, I can speak for Milton, in our form-based code, we allow some of those smaller square foot type areas so that it would lend itself to having some of these small mom and pop businesses located in there as opposed to, you know, something bigger and more chain-like. And that's the case for also Kennesaw. We talked about that there's some new zoning in Kennesaw, and we'll wait to see East Park Village. We'll wait to see how that works out. It's fairly new in the past year or so that zoning code form-based was put in. As far as infill, we have seen in Douglas and as well as in Milton that some of the zoning codes can help. I mean, if it's written well, can help with getting the mom and pop or being more compatible with some of the mom and pop to locate in those areas with existing buildings. And again, with displacement of those, in reality, our examples for in Milton, for example, we had some redevelopment that happened, but it was sort of businesses that already went dormant. So in the true sense, we didn't feel like it was a displacement, but just thinking about it in terms of the market at some point would have pushed those businesses out to where they went out of business or moved, right? Or moved to somewhere else that, you know, like Alison Duncan was mentioning, they were trying to relocate from maybe closer in the metro to further out because of pricing. And so that is sort of a push out sort of a thing, which then years later, it, you know, became a redevelopment with the Starbucks and so on. There's also new zoning codes like that could allow micro businesses and home occupation type. So yet to be determined if that will be approved and so on. This was the case for Douglas. And then Stephen mentioned about financial incentives, that maybe there is something to offering some financial incentives or other types of incentives for the small businesses to remain in these downtowns and redevelopment. And our group can add to whatever I missed.
Thank you, Michelle. And as we go into, we are running a little bit long on our time and want to get to the larger group discussion. So if we can keep our discussion outline to a little bit of a minimum so we can get to the end discussion, we'd appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to move to room 2. And thanks, Michelle.
So this is Marissa Jackson, planner at the City of South Fulton. And in room 2, we had Kylie, Toussaint, Caroline, Ashley, and Jeff. And our conversation talked about perhaps some of the good in redevelopment and how it's helping the community, and also some of the challenges that people are having. We outlined that in Tucker, the community is trying to adapt to changes and shifts in the population. So some of the new businesses there have been to cater to the needs of what millennials and new homeowners might like. And so they've tried to attract breweries and barbecue and other places downtown. And it is a bit of a challenge because it might raise some of the property values, but it also kind of speaks to what people in the community are looking for. We also talked about how in Henry County, they're trying to have positive redevelopment through their highway overlay project. And so they're hoping that it will lead to like better or more targeted development, because as people and new businesses come in, there will be required to kind of reach out to have like improvements and help like remodel buildings and things like that to meet the overlay standards. That's something that they're trying to do to help businesses that are there, but also leverage that to kind of make improvements to the highway corridor. Caroline and Marietta said that they're working on balancing different opinions and inputs from multiple groups, because while some people are excited about the new businesses and the redevelopment that's coming, some people are kind of worried and saying like, where do I go, or what's going to happen to my community if this happens? And so they're doing some community engagement to try and reach out to see what different people are looking for. And then I talked about how in South Fulton, Jeff asked about our TAD program for the Old National Overlay the Old National District. And I was saying that there's some benefits to like the cultural things on Old National, like if you need to get your hair braided quickly or you have a flat tire, then you know exactly where to go to get it fixed. But some of those cultural things there also need to be balanced with new development and restaurants and things like that. So as a city, we're trying to gain some balance in that also.
Thank you, Marissa. Room number 3.
I believe that was our room. Hello, everybody. I'm Emily Giordano from the city of Atlanta. And I feel like we were just getting started. We had so much more to say, but we heard from Fairburn and learning about what worked there in response to COVID in terms of surveys that they had already done and their business-to-business relationships and the way they were able to support businesses, especially through Main Street resources and assistance. And then Kelly and I, both from Atlanta, were looking at how these issues have impacted our communities, specifically in Little Five Points, hearing how there's been a lot of the restaurants and other retail spots have had a hard time finding workers, and how this was an issue before COVID and has only gotten worse. And also just look at what it means for the role of business associations, how key those have been, but how with the Main Street model, which is what we're starting to use in Atlanta, how there's also this balance of reaching the businesses beyond just the central Main Street district, and how we're working to provide support besides what just business owners can do for themselves, bringing in a larger coalition to support those communities. And lastly, just hearing from Don some of the examples of developments that have had issues with gentrification, specifically, or change, neighborhood change and displacement rather. And just thinking about the question of whether some of these big developers even make the effort to reach out to the legacy or longstanding businesses, and just looking at the fact that how little has been done in some cases to preserve some of these businesses in our city. So, and please, if anyone else, add to what I missed.
Thank you, Emily. We'll go to group 4, room 4.
I think that was our group, and I'll speak on behalf of our group, and I'll take the fall for it because we didn't assign a scribe, so I'm the scribe. I'll report back. But we had a unique group because we had a real estate broker, we had a county, and then we had a regional commission besides the ARC. We had the Northwest Georgia Regional Commission at the table, so we got very different perspectives on this. And I'll just share a couple of quick things. One, obviously, we talked about how a particular piece of infrastructure like the Beltline has the ability to displace a lot of small businesses, and how there's a lot of these small businesses have very little leverage to be able to renegotiate and be able to stay in their spots. So them trying to work together to see if there is an ability to negotiate their rent or being able to stay in their current locations is a struggle for small businesses that have been around before the Beltline came there. Then we heard the other side of it, which is in rural areas where maybe the increasing rent is not necessarily the issue, but the rents have been the same. But just with the pandemic and everything, there has been a loss of maintenance of these properties. And over time, as these properties have fallen into disrepair, that itself presents a new set of challenges, because trying to raise the rents as you're trying to fix the building too and trying to make it usable has proved to be a unique challenge in rural areas. And then again, from the county's perspective, Ron Roberts from Douglas County shared something which was very interesting, in that there is a new set of small businesses that is beginning to come into the community, but at the same time, the nature of those businesses might be shifting. So he gave a very interesting example of how there was a small neighborhood grocery store which used to exist, but that didn't survive the pandemic and got turned around, and now it's a healthcare use. So it's a speech therapy kind of facility, which again, small business, but at the end of the day, fundamentally different in the character of what it provides to the community and how it interacts with the community. So anyhow, those were some of the interesting things that we heard, and I'll sort of go to the next group in interest of time.
Thank you, Sam. Group number 5.
Deanna, is that us? I think so. Hey, this is Jennifer Ball, downtown Atlanta. And we had little 5 points as well, City of Marietta, City of South Fulton, Indiana. And I think our conversation was maybe more about advice, not specifics, but we confirmed that words matter, and the word gentrification means nothing to a small business. They want to talk about managing through change and displacement. I think we had a good conversation about what is the appropriate role of government, and that this is a policy decision to want to intervene into market dynamics, and that if maybe your city's not ready to enter into market dynamics, but if they are, that's a deliberate policy decision that needs leadership support to invest in tools. We had government and some of us that work at CID, so CIDs can kind of be in that flexible space, I think, early on in those conversations. We talked about how you really can't disconnect commercial displacement from residential change, because the residences and the homes are the market. And so, yes, it's different, but the trends and the overall trajectory, that they're very intertwined, because that's how you define the community. And we really advocated in the development of the toolkit to somehow get to businesses and hear their voices and their perspective, to be very clear that if this is a toolkit for planners, that it has the insight and input from the folks in theory that we're trying to support. I think that's it.
Thank you, Jennifer. And we'll go on to room number 6.
Okay, hello. I am we didn't have a scribe either, so I'm going to just read some of the notes that was not spoken to earlier. In our group, we had Laurel from DeKalb County, Gwen from Henry County, Locust Grove, Linda representing Brookhaven, and James, I'm not sure where you're located, but some of the pieces that was spoken to, we did deviate a little bit from the questions that we were, presented with, but we discussed the role of a planner and the importance of really being rooted into the history of the local community, not relying on education or where they're from, but the importance of knowing the community, their needs and wants, aspirations. Another topic of conversation that came up was the difference between natural change versus forced change. And some of the thoughts that came out of that was like really looking at the impact of policies that were made and being able to track that. And then also, like what is the disconnect between the community and the policies? So being able to really identify what those pieces were that are causing the change. and as well as any other predatory actions. Everyone expressed that there was a need for the toolkit and to have tracking tools, just because there's not really any implementation in any of those places currently. And then I will say the other piece that was spoken to that I haven't heard was a mind shift within small businesses. It is tough to compete with big box stores or corporate businesses. However, being able to have like strategic changes, maybe some supports, putting in policies to help small businesses to make that shift. So, and if I miss anything, feel free to speak to it. Thanks.
Sorry, thank you. We'll go on to group number 7, please.
I was group 7. My name is Riley. I'm in Cobb County. I was also in the group with Josh and Austin, who is from the city of Doraville. I think he had to jump off though. We talked a little bit about the changing demographics in Doraville and I guess balancing new development around Beaufort Highway with aging real estate. We talked a little bit about small business support. I'm previously from a Main Street community where we did do small business tracking. That was mostly like boots on the ground, monitoring whether businesses were moving within the district, outside of the district, or closing altogether, which was really helpful to get a better overview of the health of the community. And something else that I have, I guess, noticed in my experience from a city to a county is the perception of support around new business and expanding business, but not necessarily that same safety net for existing business. So there's not that same kind of culture of support for a business that might be struggling or might be trying to stay open around a changing community and might not have the assets similar to the professional services that were talked about earlier. They may not have that financial support, that legal support. They may want to stay open in a changing community, but just don't know how to do so. So that small business support network, I think, would be really helpful.
Thank you, Riley. We'll go on to group number 8.
Okay, I think
Sorry, that's me. Just took a minute to unmute. Yeah. Okay, so we had a great conversation. Representation from Locust Grove, Doraville, Tucker, and Cherokee County. And Anna asked us some really smart questions. Some of the thoughts on Locust Grove were the same as other areas. When legacy businesses close, even if they relocate, we out of the one space, we don't want to lose them in the area. So how do you keep them in the area? Beaufort Highway, there was discussion about the form-based code, and in Doraville, once that corridor starts to redevelop, the gentrification is going to happen with the small businesses being replaced or displaced. One of the challenges that we identified with mixed use is that it's nice, but it's more expensive. Right now, a lot of our communities have situations where it's a small building, it's privately owned, and the rents are affordable. But when you bring in something bigger, they may want to stay in the same place, but of course it's new, it's shiny, it's pretty, but everything is more expensive, and so they're displaced. And along those lines, in discussing solutions and strategies, one thought was a business incubator in the community. Another was every municipality has the business licenses. And when someone signs those, do you know if they bought the building or if it's a lease? If it's a lease, why not check in with them a couple of years into the lease to see how it's going, to see if they intend on staying, because they know if they're going to stay. They've got to make an economic decision of whether they're going to go to another space. See if you can keep them in the area. I think it's too easy to be like a cell phone company or a cable company and always thinking about the new customer rather than focusing on your primary existing customers. And praise is cheap. We have ribbon cuttings for new businesses, but I think we don't always go back and celebrate the folks that have been there 20 years. I mean, that's a huge accomplishment and a big staple in the community. So just ways to recognize folks that are there and keep them on the radar so that you know what's going to happen before it happens, rather than it's closed and we're all going, oh gosh, wish we had known, and then they're out of luck. So, but the boots on the ground approach is great. It's time consuming, but I think it's ideal. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. And I do agree, although time consuming, that is a great way to get involved with your businesses. And last but not least, room number 9.
Right. Hello, my name is Ryan Flom. I'm with the ARC. I took our notes in group number 9. Similarly to the last group, we had a really diverse bunch with folks from Old Fourth Ward, Powder Springs, and unincorporated DeKalb contributing to our conversation. And so when we were talking about commercial gentrification and the preservation of culturally significant legacy businesses, we had 3 pretty unique responses and sets of issues confronted by the folks we talked to. In Old Fourth Ward, and especially with respect to the Sweet Auburn area, we heard about the replacement of legacy and culturally significant small businesses, not necessarily with big businesses and chains so much, but rather that they're being replaced by other small businesses that have access to greater resources or out-of-town investors. So we're seeing a change from less local ownership, but not necessarily, again, replacement by those big chains. And then we also heard a bit about the importance of legacy landowners who are contributing to keeping rents relatively affordable compared to the surrounding area, which is probably contributing to staving off the displacement of more legacy businesses. And this appears to be pretty important in preserving these legacy and cultural landscapes in certain parts of the Old Fourth Ward. And then from unincorporated DeKalb, the issues expressed were more related to the loss of businesses and bigger businesses like Sam's Club and Publix's, which leave big boxes vacant and leaves ultimately the buildings to slowly dilapidate. And then the issues faced really are related to the resources don't currently exist to help move small or medium-sized businesses into these abandoned spaces. And the key issue that we heard expressed from Brian was that there needs to be greater access to capital for businesses to move in and make free use of this space. And there are currently not resources to make reuse of those spaces. And then from Powder Springs, the gentrification or displacement really pressure that we heard about was actually because Powder Springs is more of a bedroom community, that there's pressure from residential developers and investors to displace commercial and business spaces for more housing. And I'll note that Sean also expressed there was a trend toward the diversification of Powder Springs, and that while he didn't have any data on hand to necessarily show it, it seems like the business landscape in Powder Springs might actually be diversifying right now. And then across all 3 groups, we really heard about the need for resources or to develop or redevelop spaces into affordable and ready to use commercial. An example that came up multiple times was like a restaurant space with a ready to go kitchen that doesn't have to be furnished and prepared by whoever moves into it. Yeah, I think that's what I have from our group. If I missed anything, please jump in.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you everyone for participating. It's obvious that we're just scratching the surface on this topic. Probably needed a little bit more time than an hour and a half to go through it. We did have a list of questions that we were going to ask at the end, but as 10:28, I think 2 questions that are key to us moving forward with this effort are: 1, what specific items in the toolkit will be of most help to the group? And 2, what other groups do you think that we need to reach out to? And I think if, and Jared can say how we can participate.
Yeah. Yes. So for those of you who participate in LUCC virtually before, we're using Poll Everywhere. So you can either join by text or join by the website. If you want to join by the web, the instructions are under join by the web. If you want to join by text, please text CDEB 555 to 22333. And that will join the poll. And then you can, the first question is, what types of resources would you like to see in a toolkit? and just kind of text in anything that you would like to see as well. So I'll leave the instructions up there for a little bit longer. Yeah.
And you can also feel free to speak as well, if you just want to have a conversation as well.
Or enter it in the chat.
All the options.
Okay, I'm gonna, just give me 1 second.
Capital resources, always a big one. Case studies, perfect. Yeah, and the historic preservation resources, I think a few of the groups brought this up about aging buildings in their downtown areas and how to keep those businesses in those areas while updating the building so they can still be used. We've got sample tracking worksheets, that's awesome. Outreach tools, financial support information. I do think coming from a local government background, having a resource that you can provide to your local businesses in an easy fashion so they know what options are out there for them. And I think all of these tools that are being listed here can be included in that toolkit. Good questions for stakeholders. That's a great one. So you're not wasting people's time and making sure you're getting to the key issue.
Business mapping.
Is the text working? Because I got an error message on that. Maybe it's error, user error.
Yeah, so to the number 22333, text the word CDEB 555, and then it should pop up, you join ComDev session.
Now this is a longer one. Best practices for cities to support smaller businesses, infrastructure improvements and policy improvements, small neighborhood commercial districts, pathways for legacy businesses, inventory and space size mapping. Along with the inventory, whoever put this comment in, I don't have access to the person that put the comment in. Do communities need mapping assistance? Do they need resources to find out space size? But we can just keep that one there. In my group, we talked about a lot of regulatory changes and things that small businesses need to respond to the new environment after COVID. Not want to call out Allison Duncan, but maybe Allison, if you can kind of highlight what you've been experiencing in Douglasville, that would be helpful, or Douglas County, excuse me.
Say that again, a response to COVID in Douglas County?
Yeah, you were speaking about the need for additional space and outside space with your businesses.
Sure. Yeah, sorry, I didn't follow that train there. But yeah, so I think one of the things that we talked about is that, one of the things we're seeing in Douglas are going to be businesses maybe moving out of some of the closer in areas, right? Kind of coming to Douglas County. And part of that is looking for more space, where they can, kind of set up their own shop and kind of build to suit what they need to. But I think coming along with that, one of the things that we offer is a lot of greenfield opportunity. And so we're getting requests for things like, outdoor storage, outdoor parking, for heavy equipment, and then just kind of like outdoor spaces in general that can be used. And that isn't a conversation that's always gone over as easily with some of the neighbors, when we have to go through zoning entitlement and things like that. So I think we're kind of definitely in a transition, and looking to kind of just be thoughtful about where we go next as we kind of see all of these changes coming forward. So this has been really interesting discussion today, to hear a lot of what other folks are doing out there.
Absolutely. And I think there'll be more discussions to come. One other thing that's come up a little bit on this feed is zoning and zoning associated with your small businesses. Anything from the uses to any kind of updates on their buildings, expansions. Is there anyone who'd like to discuss some zoning issues that they might have and some help that they might need in the toolkit? not to pick on my group again, but Stephen Arms had mentioned that he's had some zoning issues with parking that might be an impediment to small businesses moving in some areas. If you'd want to discuss that really quickly.
That was just one example. You know, when you get small from a commercial standpoint, you still have to deliver all the other things that are required in a larger project, and all those costs are compressed down into a smaller square footage. So things like having to accommodate parking on your lot, stormwater, you know, for a relatively small site, really start to add up. Those are just a couple of examples, but you can kind of see where it gets very inefficient to develop new small scale commercial. And that's why you don't see a lot of it. And unless it's shadow anchored by a larger destination type retailer or in a grocery anchored shopping center, that's why those smaller suites tend to occur in those types of environments. So anyway, one thing I was trying to text, and I see Jared did send me the information. It's a technical difficulty on my part, but DCA used to have an extensive toolkit, and we might want to just, I don't know if that's still available online, but I know a lot of effort went into that. It's at least 10 years old, you know, since I think the last toolkit was uploaded, but there might be some interesting research there. So.
And hey, Carrie, this is Allison. I'm going to pick on our group again, because when you talked about zoning, one of the things that I thought was a really neat idea that I took away from this conversation was what Michelle and Albert shared about kind of having form codes and then looking at, you know, prohibited uses rather than allowed uses, right? And does that give more flexibility to say, this is the stuff we really don't want in that area, but then kind of let the form drive what is allowed without actually having those allowed and special use permit allowed uses. I thought that was just something that, you know, I will definitely take away from this conversation and put in practice.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. I think we've gotten a lot of requests for financial mechanisms for redevelopment and new development. And also one note that one of our participants put out there on the chat was that there's needs to be tools for small businesses for the fees for their business licenses, different than a larger scale business. So I think that's something we can look into as well. I think in the interest of time, we may want to go to the next question.
The next question is, who should we be talking to about this issue to learn more?
Yeah, the existing toolkits as a starting off point is a great idea. And I was also thinking, talking to the Small Business Administration to see what kind of tools that they had as well, so that we could incorporate that into our toolkit, and maybe they could be a partner for some of our small businesses. Local chambers. EDA, absolutely a good option. There may or may not be additional funds coming down from the federal government. There may be funds available for this type of small business redevelopment. And this kind of piggybacks on this question, but is there anyone that's gotten some specific requests from their local businesses about what they specifically need that we may incorporate into the toolkit? Keep getting in some good options for contacts. Yeah, I think this has come up a number of times. It's hard to capture the smallest businesses except to go and actually talk to them in person. That seems to be an important city function, or your downtown development authority or a chamber. business associations. It's a great one. So we have a lot of people to talk to, obviously. It's a multifaceted issue that we'll have to deal with. But I think we can be very successful with the toolkit. And of course, at any time after this meeting, if people come up with any ideas that they have for the toolkit, I know we're just, again, talking about it for the first time, but please email those to any of our ARC staff and we'll be happy to look into it for you.
All right, I think that's the last of the polls. So thank you very much. And Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Jared. And thanks, Lynn, and for kicking this off, and all the information you shared. And also thanks everyone for being a great sport, turning out your videos. It's always good to see everyone. Frankly, it really did sort of make my day when we came back from the small group and I saw all your faces. So thanks for playing along with our silly request. But hope you all enjoyed the conversation we had today. I think Carrie said this is just scratching the surface. We are obviously anticipating that this is going to require us to do a lot of conversations, a lot of outreach, and a lot of research on our end, because at the end of the day, I think our goal definitely is to have something that is not a 100-page toolkit, but something that can be in your hands and you're able to use to start supporting your small businesses. So as we sort of go on that journey, we'll be sure to reach out to you. If any of you have a very keen interest in helping us craft this, please do feel free to reach out to Carrie Stevens at this point. So she's point on our end for this work. So please feel free to reach out to her directly and we can route the request accordingly within our group. But again, thank you. Thanks for sort of spending your morning with us, and apologies for going a bit long. But you all have a great rest of your day and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.